Stop whatever you are doing, because what just detonated inside hip-hop over the last 7 days is not a story. It is a crime scene, and the body on the floor belongs to a man who spent the last 20 years telling the world he was untouchable. There is a very specific kind of silence that follows a public execution, the kind of silence where you can actually hear a career flatlining in real time, and that silence is currently swallowing every corner of the industry. From Miami to Toronto to every studio in Atlanta where the phones have gone suspiciously cold. Rick Ross just walked himself into a wood chipper on live camera, and the shredded aftermath is so grotesque, so surgically self-inflicted, so cosmically embarrassing that historians of this genre will be pointing to July of 2026 for the next 50 years as the exact moment one of the loudest chairs in the entire building collapsed under its own weight. I am not exaggerating. I am not building suspense for the sake of building it. If you actually run the receipts on what just happened, you will find that the numbers, the timestamps, and the karma line up with such terrifying precision that it feels less like an accident and more like a script. And the wildest part is that nobody, and I mean nobody, is telling the full story with the level of detail it deserves, which is exactly why we are going to sit here and dissect every single vein of this catastrophe together. From the first arrogant syllable to the final humiliating spreadsheet. Before we get into the wreckage, you have to understand the runway, because the runway is what makes the plane crash so unforgettable. On May 15th of this year, Drake dropped Iceman, and the ground under the entire streaming economy shifted the way a fault line shifts before an earthquake. This was not a good release. This was not a strong debut. This was the kind of numerical event that forces every analyst in every label boardroom to rewrite their quarterly forecast in pencil, because the ink from the old version had already been rendered obsolete. Spotify confirmed that Iceman pulled 139.9 million streams in its first 24 hours on the platform alone, cementing the Toronto man as the single most streamed artist in a solo day window across the entire calendar of 2026. The album eventually stacked over 1.63 billion streams and locked in the crown as the most streamed rap album of the year on that single service. Songs like Maid of Honor, Habibti, and Make Them Cry were not just charting, they were oxygen. You could not walk through a barber shop, sit through a dinner reservation, scroll a single social feed, or step into a corner bodega without hearing his voice bleeding out of a speaker somewhere. The man dropped 3 full-length projects at once, 43 tracks released at midnight in one coordinated cultural strike, and the entire distribution architecture of modern music groaned, trying to hold the volume. Apple Music, Amazon Music, Spotify, every platform independently posted historic tallies. Amazon confirmed it was the biggest debut day globally for any artist on their service in all of 2026. Records were not just broken. They were reduced to rubble. And standing on the sideline of that supernova, arms crossed, sneering into a microphone, was Rick Ross. And he was not celebrating. He was seething. The man who spent 2 decades stitching his brand onto the phrase biggest boss decided the correct response to appear setting the streaming earth on fire was to launch a full-scale, multi-platform, multi-week smear tour declaring the album unlistenable. Not that it was not for him. Not that it missed his personal taste. He looked into a lens on video and told the world that Iceman was horrendous. He said the people on his own payroll, humans he literally cuts checks to keep near him, sat through the album and by the 5th song stumbled out of the room and told him it was whack. He said his staff lost 60 minutes of their lives to it and described the experience with the word trauma. Trauma. Let that word sit in the air for a second. He deployed clinical language of psychological injury to characterize the experience of listening to something that 139.9 million voluntary human beings pressed play on in 24 hours. He borrowed the vocabulary of victimhood to describe an interaction with an album that was actively raising the ceiling of the format. And that word choice tells you everything you need to understand about the psychology at play here. Because that is not criticism. That is not veteran perspective. That is not measured artistic evaluation. That is a man staring at somebody else's coronation and feeling so diminished by proximity that his only coping mechanism was to drag the crown into the mud with him. And the deliciously poetic part is that while Ross was running microphone to microphone calling Iceman a disaster, Iceman was posting numbers that Rick Ross has not touched in a decade, will not touch in this decade, and quite frankly will never touch again for the rest of his natural life. That is not an insult. That is arithmetic. That is cold, uncompromising, mathematically documented reality, and no amount of interview swagger can rewrite a spreadsheet. But the tour did not stop at insults. It escalated into full-body absurdity. The Miami rapper began questioning the entirety of Drake's legacy on the record. He started saying things like, "Where is his Billie Jean? Where is his Thriller?" He actually invoked Michael Jackson's catalog as a bar of comparison, as if there is a single record in his own discography that lives on the same shelf as Thriller. Name one Rick Ross song with the cultural DNA of Billie Jean. Name one album in the man's 20-year run that reorganized the architecture of the music industry the way Michael Jackson's flagship project did. You cannot. Nobody can. The comparison was so wildly disproportionate that it revealed the desperation underneath the volume. Then he escalated further and claimed you do not hear anything on Iceman like Empire State of Mind, as if every rap release that does not contain a stadium-sized city anthem is automatically a failure, which by his own metric would demolish almost every project in his own catalog. He was reaching so aggressively to tear his target down that he was actively contradicting his own body of work in the same breath. He was undermining his own resume while trying to undermine somebody else's. It is one of the most bizarre self-inflicted rhetorical spirals in modern music media history. Then he took the entire performance and drove it directly onto Hot 97. He walked into that studio and told the world nobody fears Drake's album release. He said the Six God is not at his level. He called the numbers fake. He said the streets are the streets. He said if his opponent was who he claimed to be, he would have squashed the litigation and moved on. He described the entire legal push as a signal of weakness. He implied he might sue anyone who spoke his own name in the wrong tone. And through every single one of those interviews, through every single second of that carnival, he was doing one thing and one thing only. He was promoting his own upcoming album, Set in Stone, arriving July 17th. Go get it. Biggest Boss. Album of the year. He said the phrase on TMZ. He said it on Instagram. He said it during appearances. He said it at any camera that would blink at him. Do you see what was actually happening? Do you see the play underneath the play? He was not simply hating for hate's own sake. He was using Drake's name, Drake's momentum, and Drake's cultural relevance as a promotional carrier wave for his own project. Every interview slot where he trashed Iceman was an interview slot where he name-dropped Set in Stone. Every clip of him calling his rival washed was a clip where he told the audience to pre-order his release. He was parasitically welded to the OVO founder's cultural oxygen, siphoning attention that man generates and using it to shine a floodlight on a project nobody was asking for. And that is the layer nobody is pointing at. The hate was not hate. The hate was a rollout strategy. And it was the most catastrophically failed rollout strategy in the recent memory of the genre, because the product it was strapped to was fundamentally broken from the concept stage. And this is where the story pivots from sad to spectacular, because on July 17th, the album finally landed. And what happened next is going to be studied in marketing programs and executive briefings for the next 100 years as the textbook example of what happens when the mouth writes checks the music cannot cover. The first week reporting numbers came back so grim that the initial screenshots were mistaken for typos. The project moved approximately 17,000 album equivalent units in its opening frame. 17,000, not 170,000. Not 107,000. Not even 70,000. 17,000. It debuted at number 45 on the Billboard 200. Number 45. Not 4. Not 14. Not 24. 45. For context, this man's earlier releases were regularly kicking down the door of the top 5 with weekly sales in the hundreds of thousands. Port of Miami moved 187,000 in 2006. God Forgives, I Don't cleared 218,000 in 2012. Mastermind posted 179,000 in 2014. And now, in the year 2026, with 20 years of brand equity behind him, with an entire persona engineered around dominance, Rick Ross could not scrape 20,000 units together and could not crack the top 40. The man who called himself the loudest chair in the game could not outsell debut projects from artists whose names have not yet reached your feed. He could not outsell first releases from teenagers who put their first ever song on SoundCloud 3 months earlier. And the streaming ledger was even more brutal. He pulled approximately 1.1 million total streams on release day across every platform on the planet combined. All platforms. Total. 1.1 million. Drake pulled 139.9 million on Spotify alone in a single day. Say that number in your head one more time and let it hit your chest properly. Drake got 139.9 million streams in one day on one service. Rick Ross got 1.1 million streams across every service on Earth on the best day his album will ever have. That is not a gap. That is a chasm. That is a geological feature that took millions of years to form. That is the kind of numerical disparity that makes you look at both names side by side and wonder how they ever ended up in the same conversation about who is better at making music. And the audience already spoke with a volume no podcast monologue can compete with. And here is where the humiliation crosses into legend. Here is the detail that transforms this from a business flop into a cultural fossil that will outlive everyone involved. Tory Lanez is in prison, physically locked in a cell, unable to promote a single thing, unable to sit for an interview, unable to shoot a music video, unable to hit a stage, unable to send a tweet from his own device or step into a studio without permission from a corrections officer. And Tory Lanez, from behind bars, was averaging 1.4 million streams per day on Spotify alone. A man who cannot see the sun without approval was outstreaming a man walking free through Miami with a book tour and a Verzuz battle and a TMZ camera crew and a full press cycle. A man who cannot even physically hold a phone was generating more daily listeners than a man doing Instagram lives, radio hits, and podcast circuits. If that fact does not shrink you down into complete silence, nothing in this life will. If that fact does not force a full recalibration of every decision made in the previous 12 months, you are operating inside a level of delusion that no external reality can penetrate. And while we are on it, we have to talk about the Verzuz battle, because the Verzuz battle is this entire saga compressed into a single evening under one set of stage lights. Rick Ross took a Verzuz stage across from French Montana. French Montana. The artist the internet has collectively agreed is the poster boy for mid-tier commercial rap. The artist whose own comment section roasts him weekly. The artist who has become a walking punchline for making music that technically exists but rarely resonates. Rick Ross stood across from that man, one-to-one, hit for hit, and lost. He lost that hit-for-hit battle to French Montana. The same man walking around calling himself the loudest chair in the entire genre. The same man asking where Drake's Billie Jean was. Could not outperform French Montana on a shared stage. That should have been the mirror. That should have been the moment where he looked at himself, softened his tone, focused inward, and recalibrated. Instead, he doubled the volume. He tripled the noise. He hated harder. He talked louder. He hunted more cameras. And the universe was quietly keeping score. And the universe was preparing a verdict that would echo through the last chapter of his career. Then, right on cue, 50 Cent showed up. 50 Cent always shows up. 50 Cent has built an entire second act out of smelling weakness in the water and orbiting like a shark specifically trained to detect a rival's stumble from 3 miles out. Within hours of those first week reports hitting the internet, he was posting. Rick Ross moved 17,000 units and 50 Cent was right there with the popcorn ready. This is a man who has been trading shots with the Miami rapper for over 15 years. This is a man who has made it his personal cardio to remind the world every time his rival slips. This is a man who has turned trolling into a discipline so refined it deserves its own museum wing. And he jumped on this like it was a national holiday. Ross tried to counter. He said 50 Cent borrowed money from people in Shreveport and never returned it. He said the Louisiana film studio deal was a scam. But here is the fundamental asymmetry. When 50 Cent trolls, the audience laughs along because he has built a documented track record of business wins that gives his trolling structural weight. When Ricky Rosary tries to fire back, the audience looks at his release week ledger and laughs at him instead because his own house is currently smoldering. You cannot talk tough about another man's business when your own business just posted the worst weekend of your career. You do not carry the leverage. You are standing on a foundation of 17,000 units trying to throw stones at somebody else's glass tower. The math cannot back the mouth. You are swinging a paper sword at a steel wall. And there is the book. Because through all of this, through every hate-tour stop and every microphone confrontation, he was also pushing a book. Renaissance of a Boss. His third. A book supposedly about finding new fuel after 20 summers of winning. And I want you to sit with that title for one deliberate, uncomfortable moment. Renaissance of a Boss. A renaissance is a rebirth. A renaissance is a flowering of new cultural mass. A renaissance is what history records when an artist crosses into a new peak, a new awakening, an unmistakable second era of relevance and vitality. The historical Renaissance is what gave us Michelangelo and Leonardo and the rebirth of European intellectual civilization. He titled his book Renaissance of a Boss, and then dropped an album that moved 17,000 copies and debuted at number 45 on the Billboard chart. That is not a renaissance. That is a funeral procession. That is a wake. That is the exact moment where the mourners gather around the casket and somebody stands up, says a few kind words, and everyone goes home to try and forget. You do not get to call something a renaissance while the data screams decline. You do not get to reach for the vocabulary of rebirth while the ledger paints a picture of a slow death. You do not get to frame yourself as blooming while the audience has declared your petals wilted. And then look at what he said when he was finally cornered, when the numbers had landed and reality had walked into the room and there was no more oxygen for the boss talk. When TMZ caught him and asked if he was ready to put the beef to rest, he suddenly went diplomatic. Suddenly he was measured. Suddenly, he was saying things like, as a boss, that is where I put it to sleep, and you may interpret it as squashing the beef. You may interpret it as Ricky Rosary being diplomatic. Suddenly, the man calling Iceman horrendous and telling the world Drake was beneath him pivoted to ambiguity, to evasion, to careful lawyer-adjacent non-answers. Why the sudden softening? Why the pivot to graceful language? Because the numbers arrived. Because reality knocked. Because he stared at 17,000 units and number 45 on the Billboard 200 and realized the war he started was one he was never structurally equipped to win, never mentally prepared to fight, and never coming back from. You do not get to empty your entire arsenal into the air, miss every single round, hit nothing but sky, and then wave a white flag as if you are being generous. That is not how conflict works. That is not how respect works. And that is certainly not how the streets he keeps invoking actually operate. In the streets, when you start something and it ends badly, you do not get to call a timeout. You do not get to tap out. You wear the consequence. You wear the outcome. And the outcome here is that he went from being a respected veteran with a legendary catalog to being the man who picked a fight he could not close, talked the loudest while losing the hardest, and begged for a ceasefire when the invoice arrived. But here is where the story gets genuinely beautiful, and I need you to slow down for this part, because this is where the meaning lives, beyond the numbers and beyond the memes and beyond the timeline dunking. Drake did not respond. He did not need to respond. He did not go on Instagram Live and fire back. He did not release a diss single. He did not sit for a podcast to demolish Set in Stone even though the streaming data would have carried the water for him. He did not book a Verzuz battle. He did not go on Hot 97 to declare nobody fears Rick Ross's album. He did not do any of it. He stayed silent. He stayed on the workday. He kept living his life, breaking his records, filling his arenas, dropping his music, and letting the data speak with a clarity no human voice can rival. And that, more than any diss track ever could, more than any Instagram post ever will, is what makes this whole saga a masterclass in dealing with people who try to shrink you. Because think about what Drake actually did. On Iceman, he included a track called Make Them Pay, and on it, he rapped a single bar aimed at his Miami critic. One bar. One surgical, precise, devastating observation buried inside a song on an album that was going to be streamed 139.9 million times in 24 hours, no matter what the bar said. He did not need a full dedicated diss track. He did not need a media rollout. He did not need to burn interview cycles tearing anyone down. He made one comment on one song and then watched his target self-destruct in real time, on camera, across every platform. Drake understood something the biggest boss never did and possibly never will. When you are winning, you do not narrate the victory. When the numbers vote for you, you do not add a director's commentary. When the audience has already cast 140 million ballots, you do not need to open your mouth. You just keep moving. You keep dropping. You keep building. You keep creating. And you let the people drowning in their own envy shout into a hurricane while you add another billion streams to the tally and another chapter to the resume. And there is something else happening here that I think matters more than any streaming statistic, more than any Billboard placement, more than any first-week chart position, and it is this. Drake has been keeping distance from people. Not just Rick Ross. All of them. Every single person who turned on him during the Kendrick Lamar cycle. Every single artist who tried to slither past him when they thought he was bleeding. Every single friend whose true colors showed up when the narrative flipped. He has been staying off their timelines. We saw it at the World Cup. Mr. Beast took photos with both Drake and Travis Scott, but they were never seen together in the same frame. He stayed on his side of the room. He is not reconnecting with the same figures who put a knife in his back when the tide shifted. He would rather hang out with basketball players. He would rather share his time with people who play racquetball and paddle tennis and golf. He would rather spend an afternoon with anyone except the exact people who already once tried to end him. And that is not arrogance. That is not pettiness. That is wisdom. That is a man who has been in this industry long enough, through enough waves of adoration and betrayal, to know the difference between a genuine bond and a transactional handshake. He does not need the Atlanta backroom. He does not need to be photographed with the crew that is currently outside posturing for cultural oxygen. He is his own genre. He is ubiquitous. He is a global cultural gravity well that does not need the traditional crew affiliations and regional alliances the genre used to require. And the beautiful part is that the same people who quietly distanced from him during the Kendrick fallout are the exact people who need him now. They need his features. They need his cosign. They need the algorithmic lift a mention from him provides. They need the gravitational pull his relevance gives their own careers. And he is not handing it to them. He is standing on the work. And standing on the work does not mean making loud declarations about where you stand. It does not mean announcing your position from every podcast couch. It means moving quietly, deliberately, consistently, and letting your actions author the story your mouth never has to speak. Now let us circle back to Rick Ross for one final moment, because there is a detail so cosmically cruel, so screenplay perfect in its irony, that it feels invented. Remember when he was performing Aston Martin music on his own stage? This is his own catalog, his own crowd, his own microphone. And when he performed it, the audience started singing Drake's verse. Not his parts. Drake's parts. The people who bought tickets to see Rick Ross were more excited to shout back the 16 bars a guest artist contributed than to shout back the words of the man they paid to see. And Drake noticed. He clipped the video. He commented with a laughing emoji. Because what else can you do when a man is performing his own song and the audience is more invested in your featured verse than his entire performance? That is not a diss. That is not a shot. That is a referendum. That is the audience telling you in the most direct, unfiltered, unmistakable way possible who they came to hear. And Rick Ross was standing there in real time, mic in hand, watching his own crowd sing another man's lyrics back to him. If that moment does not rearrange your entire self-perception, you are operating on a plane of delusion that no data can pierce. And speaking of home, we have to talk about Miami, because Miami is where this story reaches its most painful crescendo. Rick Ross is Miami. He has built the entire brand, the whole persona, the visual identity, the mythology, on the geography of the 305. Miami palm trees. Miami luxury. Miami beach. Miami sound. Everything about the boss package screams the city. And in Miami, specifically in Wynwood, they are throwing Drake-only nights. They are playing his music from sundown to sunrise. Not Rick Ross for an hour and Drake for an hour. Drake for the entire night. In the city Rick Ross has spent 2 decades claiming as his throne, the population is choosing to spend their weekends in rooms saturated with Drake's music instead of his own. Walk down Ocean Drive right now. You hear Maid of Honor from the storefronts. You hear Habibti from the restaurants. You hear Make Them Cry from car speakers at every stoplight. You do not hear Ming Code. You do not hear the Set in Stone singles. You do not hear the French Montana and Max B collab the man was so proud of. The album landed and dissolved like a stone thrown into the deepest trench of the Atlantic. It sank. It went straight to the bottom. And nobody sent a rescue. And there is a Drake lyric that lands differently now, a line that has taken on an entirely new meaning in the light of everything we just laid out. I get more love than you in your own city. When he first delivered that line, everyone assumed it was aimed at Kendrick Lamar. Everyone assumed the punch was directed at Compton, at Kendrick's backyard, at the city that produced the man who dropped the most damaging diss in recent history. But what if it was not? What if Drake was reading a completely different map? What if he was looking at the Drake-only Wynwood nights, at the crowd singing his verses back to Rick Ross, at the streaming heat concentrated in South Florida, at the cultural temperature of the entire Miami skyline tilting his way, and realized he genuinely, measurably, verifiably gets more love in Rick Ross's own city than Rick Ross does? That is not a hypothetical anymore. That is not speculation. That is an observable, ambient, checkable reality that any human being with a phone and a pair of ears can confirm inside 20 minutes. Walk into a club on South Beach and request a set in Stone Deep Cut. Watch the DJ's face freeze. The contrast will tell you everything you need to know. And what makes all of this even harder to watch, even more uncomfortable to process, is that Rick Ross did every last inch of this to himself. Every mile. Nobody forced him onto a camera to call Iceman horrendous. Nobody forced him to say his team suffered trauma listening. Nobody forced him to invoke Michael Jackson's Thriller as a comparison bar. Nobody forced him to walk into Hot 97 and declare nobody fears the album. Nobody forced him to allege the numbers were fake. Nobody forced him to accept a Verzuz stage next to French Montana and lose. Nobody forced him to promote his book and his album in every breath while carpet-bombing a man who was minding his own business and setting records that will probably never fall. He made every single one of those decisions voluntarily, enthusiastically, repeatedly, with full awareness and full control over his own words. Nobody pushed him. Nobody cornered him. Nobody baited him. He dove headfirst with his eyes wide open into water that was so much shallower than he assumed, and the impact was catastrophic. And here is the ultimate lesson, and I want everybody listening to absorb this at the cellular level because it applies far beyond hip-hop and far beyond music and far beyond the specific names in this particular saga. Hate is a terrible investment. Hate is a terrible operating strategy. Hate is a terrible foundation for anything you are trying to actually build. When you pour your energy into shrinking somebody else, you are not enlarging yourself. You are not advancing your own square. You are spending your capital on demolition while your own construction site sits idle and abandoned. Rick Ross spent months, literal calendar months, on every platform he could find, spending every ounce of cultural credit and personal credibility and industry goodwill he had accumulated across 2 decades, not on promoting his art, not on celebrating his catalog, not on constructing something positive, not on making anything that would stand on its own merits, but on trying to convince the world Drake's music was bad. And the world responded by streaming Drake 139.9 million times in one day and streaming Rick Ross 1.1 million times on his absolute best day. The world voted. The market rendered its verdict. The audience delivered its judgment. And the judgment was unanimous, overwhelming, and irreversible. The market does not care about your opinions. The market does not care about your interviews. The market does not care about how loudly you announce that another man's work is beneath you. The market cares about what it wants. And what it wanted was Iceman. And what it did not want was set in stone. And no amount of promotional strategy dressed up as hatred was going to bend that curve. And I want to be genuinely fair here for a moment, because fairness matters and honesty matters, and the truth is always heavier than the narrative. Rick Ross has a catalog that is genuinely, undeniably impressive. He has songs that are objectively great. Songs that will still be pulled up at cookouts and in cars and through Bluetooth speakers for decades. There are tracks buried in his run that can stand next to almost anything the genre has produced. He is not a talentless artist. He is not somebody who never contributed. He has contributed enormously. He has made real music. He has had real moments. He has been a real, significant, undeniable presence in the culture for a very long time. But that is exactly what makes this so tragic, so painfully avoidable, so genuinely difficult to witness. A man with an actual legacy chose to spend the twilight of his career not celebrating that legacy, but diminishing somebody else's. A man with genuine accomplishments chose to be defined not by what he built, but by who he hated. A man with a real body of work chose to make his final chapter about somebody else's body of work instead of his own. And in doing so, he did not diminish Drake. He could not diminish Drake. He never had the wattage to diminish Drake. He diminished himself. He took his own respect, his own standing, his own hard-earned position, and set it on fire in front of the whole world, on camera, in real time, with no possibility of ever claiming any of it was pulled out of context. And for what? For an album that moved 17,000 copies. For a book nobody is discussing at any dinner table. For a Verzuz battle he lost to French Montana. For a promotional campaign that achieved the exact geometric inverse of its intended goal. The tragedy of Rick Ross in 2026 is not that his album flopped. Albums flop constantly. Good artists drop projects that miss the moment. That is the nature of a career that spans decades. The tragedy is that he made the flop inevitable by choosing hatred over artistry, envy over excellence, and noise over substance. He could have released Set in Stone and let it stand on the strength of the music. He could have promoted it with confidence and dignity. He could have said, "Here is my work, 20 years in, and I am proud of it," and let the audience judge without editorializing about somebody else's project. Instead, he made the entire promotional cycle about Drake. He made Drake the headline of every interview. He made Drake the subject of every clip. And in doing so, he told the entire industry, whether he meant to or not, that even he believes Drake is more important than he is. Because you do not spend months talking about somebody you believe is beneath you. You do not dedicate an entire press run to tearing down somebody you consider irrelevant. You do not obsess over somebody whose success does not threaten you. You only talk about somebody that much, that often, that aggressively, when their existence is making you feel smaller in real time. You only attack somebody whose success exposes your own ceiling, and that is what this was. This was a man staring at Drake's numbers, Drake's cultural weight, Drake's streaming architecture, Drake's omnipresence, and feeling so small by proximity that the only way to feel large again was to try to shrink Drake with him. And it did not work. It never works. It has never worked in the entire history of human envy. It did not work here, and it will not work the next time somebody tries the same play. So here's where we land. Here is the final accounting. Drake stood on the work. He let the music speak. He did not engage the back and forth. He did not dignify the noise with a dedicated response. He did not lower himself to the level of a man already digging his own grave with every camera he stood in front of. He kept dropping. He kept streaming. He kept breaking records. He kept selling out arenas. He kept appearing in places where the people who once turned on him could see him thriving without them. He kept moving forward with the quiet, unstoppable momentum that never needs a microphone to be felt in the room. And Rick Ross talked, and talked, and talked, and talked some more. And at the end of all that talking, after every interview and every Instagram live and every podcast lap and every TMZ segment and every Hot 97 chair, the numbers walked in the door. And the numbers told a story that all the volume in the world, all the bravado in the world, all the boss talk in the world could not rewrite. 17,000 units. Number 45 on the Billboard 200. 1.1 million total streams on release day. Tory Lanez outstreaming him from a jail cell. French Montana beating him on a Verzuz stage. 50 Cent grinning from the sideline. Drake refusing to even acknowledge his existence. Those numbers are not a setback. Those numbers are not a rough patch. Those numbers are a statement. The industry, the audience, and the algorithm collectively, unanimously, and without hesitation looked at Rick Ross, listened to every syllable of the campaign, and said, "We heard you, and we disagree." We heard every interview. We heard every claim. We heard every dismissal. We heard every attack. And the verdict is that the music matters more than the mouth. The numbers matter more than the narrative. And the art matters more than the opinion. And when the dust finally clears from this cycle, when the memes fade and the timeline moves on and the next controversy takes the center chair, that verdict is what remains carved into the wall. That is the tombstone quote for this entire chapter. The music matters more than the mouth. Now I want to hear from you, and I need you to actually think about this before you type. Do you believe Rick Ross genuinely thought Iceman was as bad as he claimed, or was this entire hate tour a calculated marketing detonation from day one? Do you think Drake actually said the line, "I get more love than you in your own city" about Rick Ross, or was it always about Kendrick? And here is the real question, the one that I want pinned to the top of the comments. Do you think there is any road left for Ricky Rosui to rebuild from this in the second half of the year, or is the chapter permanently closed? Drop it below. And listen, if you made it this far, you already know what to do. You are the reason this thing moves. Every single one of you. So if you have not already, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and stay locked in, because the next chapter of this saga is already loading. There is a video queued up right now breaking down exactly what Drake is planning to drop next and how the Miami camp is going to try to survive the fallout. Do not miss that one. Click it, watch it, and I will see you inside the next one.